In the distant future, vampires rule the night, but their numbers are dwindling. One podcast is unlike all the others. Half human, half vampire. This is Lefty Speaks, the official podcast for Vampire Hunter D.
Hello, hunters, and welcome back to Lefty Speaks, the Vampire Hunter D podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about something that is near and dear to many of our hearts. For those of you on our Discord, you'll have seen Brandon shared a recent article on CBR talking about Castlevania and some of its characters, specifically Alucard, being inspired by Vampire Hunter D and D specifically. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to discuss things that influenced the creation of Vampire Hunter D and things that were influenced by Vampire Hunter D and things that somehow sprung up by seeming sheer coincidence to be very similar things, but completely separate and unknown to the other in this crazy, insane world of fiction, fantasy, and horror that we all love. So, without further ado, let's dive in.
So, first, I want to give a great shout out to Mandy Oderfer. I think that's her name, the lady who wrote the article at CBR. It was very well researched, and it was a great topic because I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, I was watching the Castlevania show on Netflix, and it's a good, amazing moment when Alucard comes to wipe out some bad guys, and like he has upside down. Well, the sword looks like an upside down cross. It drops from the sky. It splits. I mean, it's like one of the greatest animated sequences I've ever seen. But as somebody who worked on the Vampire Hunter D pilot and graphic novel and been reading it and watching it, I just thought to myself, "Wow, that's literally D." I mean, he has the white skin, the kind of disassociated, weirdness to him. He's absolutely beautiful, and so forth and so on. And I just thought to myself, I'm like, come on. And we can't get a Vampire Hunter D show on the air. Maybe it's because there's a Castlevania show that looks exactly like Vampire Hunter D on the air. But I felt the article was extremely well done with the references and the research because sometimes people write this stuff and they don't know what they're talking about. And I think for me, Castlevania, I knew about that decades before I even heard of Vampire Hunter D. I mean, I played the original Castlevania, the very first one on a Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the Famicom in Japan. It's like one of Konami's just amazing first games, like Metroid. I mean, those games, Metroid and Castlevania, are basically what people now call a Metroidvania genre,
Mhm,
where it's a
mhm.
2D side-scrolling platformer with RPG elements. And what made the first Castlevania game so intriguing was the fact that you fought like this entire pantheon of classic horror movie and mythological villains leading up
hmm
to and including Dracula. I mean, like, you fight the Medusa, you fought, you had Frankenstein and a little tiny Igor that used to pop around. You would fight Death itself, which is one of the hardest enemies. It's hard. Beating Death in that game was harder than beating Dracula, and that was the next to the last in the first game. That was the next to the last final boss. And I just feel that it's a reason why Castlevania has persisted for so many years, whether or not the original game had anything to do with Vampire Hunter D, which I don't believe it does, because it's more just a villager who's tired of Dracula's nonsense, goes into the castle to wipe him out.
hmm
Speaking as a gamer, and I'll hand this over real quick. The mechanics of the game was something I hadn't seen before. That you also saw in the Legend of Zelda, which is certain bosses and Mega Man. Certain bosses could only be defeated by a certain object or a specific kind of object. And his weapons in the first one were a cross, a dagger, a jar of holy water, things like that. And certain enemies would succumb to certain weapons in different ways or quicker. So that little extra thing made that an amazing game for the Nintendo, just for the original Nintendo, not Super, just old good old Famicom.
I I have the exact opposite experience that you had because 'cause I was a fan of Vampire Hunter D long before I knew about, the Castlevania, the video game, and I didn't play any Castlevania until I was living in Japan and Symphony of Blood came out. So that was my first introduction. And so for me, I felt really lucky because I the whole, the, being able to go backwards, going back to the castle and go back into other areas was something that most JRPG games didn't have, right? I mean,
Right.
mostly it was all very linear.
Until
It
Chrono
might be
Trigger.
role playing,
Yeah.
but you once you cross like Final Fantasy, once you cross a certain threshold, you can't go back. You're in a different area, and that to me that mechanic was just fantastic, and of course for me I was like, I really thought it was heavily inspired by Vampire Hunter D because I had I had the book some of the books already, so
Right.
I was like,
Right.
that's very interesting, and of course the first film had already come
Yeah.
out, so
And then what I found really interesting about her article is when she got into talking about the people behind Castlevania, specifically Symphony of Night, and the characters aren't talking about how, Dee was an influence, but Alucard was also influenced by her being on a Italian fashion magazine kick. And the internet is so ubiquitous today, as shown by the fact that we're recording in 4 different cities for this episode right now. Back then, there was no internet. There was no
Right.
sharing of ideas so easily. Like, a Blade, for example. Blade and Vampire Hunter D, they're both the Dompier, the Daywalker, something is special about them, but they were created in similar times in very different mediums in different countries that were not sharing entertainment.
mhm.
It just they were not, because if you think about early anime, getting early anime into the United States required somebody physically bringing
Yep.
VHS cassettes to the United States, then a bunch of people doing a fan sub of it and then using
Right.
a bank, like literally a wall of VHS recorders to create copies that degraded every time you made a copy.
Yep.
So you
Yeah.
only had so much life off your original cassette because it would wear out because it's a magnetic strip.
Yep. Yep.
So it's amazing that anime made it to the United States or around the world to proliferate as it did in that time period of analog technology. And so Blade around that time, is here in American comic books, and you have the Vampire Hunter D books being published in Japan in completely siloed environments. I mean, there's like a wall in between. When we originally proposed doing Message from Mars, uh, Kikuchi-san asked us to give him samples because he wasn't familiar with American comic books. Because in Japan, they'll sell you a graphic novel,
Mhm.
and it's a thicker thing, but the what we think of the single issue, the floppy comic book that so many of us in North America or Europe grew up with, they they don't have that there. He didn't know what it was like. Can I have some examples? So we ended up putting a box together and mailing a box of a wide sampling of comic books to Japan. I just went to my local comic book shop and just started pulling things off the shelves, put it all in a box, and mailed. So I think he got some Robotech, some Pathfinder. There were a couple other sci-fi comics that I just saw and grabbed. I wasn't paying attention to the titles too much. I just went to the clerk, be like, "Hey, this is what I need." He's like, "All right." We just made a pile. I bought it, and away it went. And that's part of how we got Message from Mars going.
Wow.
But yeah, I find it really interesting how these things traveled. I mean, look back at the Hammer films. Christopher
Mhm.
Lee and Peter Cushing as Dracula and Dr. Van Helsing, because all of these groups, Castlevania, Vampire Hunter D, everybody does give credit back to that as something that was a major
Mhm.
part of their inspiration. And I think that's absolutely amazing. I think they made 9 of those Dracula Hammer films, something like that. But yeah, I mean, that's black and white era.
Yeah.
There's a lot though in between the release of Castlevania 1 and Symphony of the Night. Because it was
Mhm.
Castlevania 2, then Castlevania 3, then there was a bunch of little ones in between that. Then you had Castlevania 4. Then you also have to remember the Super Nintendo comes out and you get, Super Castlevania, which I think was 4. And then you had the PC one called Dracula X. Then you had something called Castlevania Rondo of Blood. And we're talking about like almost 10 games before Symphony of the Night. And the most amazing thing about a Symphony of the Night, and I don't know how many old school gamers we have in our group, in our community here, but I talk about the fact I used to work for like an anime company in Boston all the time, and we used to import stuff all the time. One of our biggest imports was the Sega Saturn, which is like the lost Sega system in
Mhm.
between Genesis and Dreamcast. But the Saturn was one of the best consoles ever released. And the American Saturn had this little slot in the back that looked like you would put a cartridge in it, but it was a disc based console. So, what was that cartridge slot for? Turns out somebody somewhere in their infinite wisdom decided to create a key. So, you stick the cartridge in the back of the Sega Saturn and you could play any Japanese game. And well, it's not localized, but you could play it. And the thing was, in 1999, I played Symphony of the Night in the American version for the first time. But then I had a friend give me the key. I popped in the back of the Sega Saturn, and suddenly I could play the Japanese version of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which had more stuff. Not only that, I could play X-Men versus Capcom, which anybody who's a real old school gamer knows that that was the one. Before Marvel versus Capcom, X-Men versus Capcom actually had better fighting mechanics, in my opinion. It was much tighter and much easier to pull off supers. Anyway, so the fact that I had access to Japanese disc-based Castlevania games on the Saturn, that changed the game for me, figuratively speaking, and it opened up a whole new thing. And I just feel that, again, despite it clearly being Vampire Hunter D as Alucard, it didn't take away from the sheer genius of how that game played. Because as we talked about many times before we even started recording, you think you're finished when you defeat the first castle, but then you find out that there's an upside down mirror version of the castle that you have to go through again. And that was something that only one other game ever did before, where you revisit, which was Chrono Trigger, which is from Squaresoft, obviously, who
Mhm.
created Final Fantasy. Chrono Trigger's mechanic you would see again in The Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time,
Mhm.
where
Mhm.
you would be in one timeline, you jump to the future, or you plant a seed in the past, literally like an acorn. Then you jump to the future, the acorn's now a tree. So now you can climb up and go and do something you weren't able to do in the past. So Chrono Trigger did that with time, and then Symphony of the Night did that with space. So you would go back through a mirror version of the castle, realizing that some things that didn't make sense in terms of structure completely make sense when it's upside down. And that was another game changer for me. I was blown away by the sheer genius of that design.
Yeah. 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 I played that, first in Japan, right? And
Mhm.
and I thought I was like I had gone through the whole game, and I was talking to, I was a junior high school teacher, and I was talking to my students about the game, and then they were like laughing at me because I had no clue that there was a whole upside down castle. I had 0 clue, and they were laughing, and I'm like, "What's going on?" I mean, because I speak Japanese, so I could, but I was like, "Wait, I know what you're saying. I understand what you're saying, but what do you mean there's a whole other castle?" And they were like the whole classroom was, like, on the ground laughing, a bunch of
Mhm.
Japanese kids in their seats, wiggling around, laughing. It was, both, funny and embarrassing at the same time. But yeah, it's still one of my favorite gaming experiences to this day. Just that whole because it revolutionized in for me, and I wasn't as experienced of a gamer as a lot of other people at that time.
Mhm.
That was the first time I played video games really was in Japan. So, as an adult, um, but it really revolutionized how games operated, and it's an interesting question because it's like is that mechanic you can still see that those types of mechanics used today in
Yeah.
in a lot of the open world settings and jumping back in time. I mean, heck, I mean the both Assassin's Creed in
Oh, yeah.
Japan, Assassin's Creed Shadow, not exactly, but it also has these flashbacks, d- kind of rounding out your character. So it's very interesting how that rippling effect, 30 years later. Yeah.
Yeah, now one of the other things I really liked about the original Castlevania games is I think of people complain about the PS1 version of the only Vampire Hunter D game that has been made.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think personally I would agree that a lot of that criticism I feel is justified. But one thing I've never seen criticized in it that I think a lot of more modern game design for these kind of games, particularly some of the Souls games, do okay, is how do you have a demigod character feel like you're playing a challenge? So you've got to have other equally powerful demigod or god characters for you to fight against to slay. Whereas what I think was brilliant about Castlevania is that you have a human who's rising up to defend his family, his home against these supernatural horrors and deific evil beings. And I think that is a great resonating story. It's like I've been discussing TTRPG possible designs of what could we do if we made a Vampire Hunter D TTRPG with some friends of mine who that's what they do. They make TTRPGs. And one of the things that we kind of agree on is you can't really play D because you're the demigod that can kill everything. Part of the fun to me of like the TTRPGs is the struggle. If everything is too easy because you're so powerful, then it's not a lot of fun. It's also not a lot of fun if you're the only person who gets to be the demigod and everybody else is kind of just
Yeah.
carried along by
Yeah.
you. That's no fun. So, to me, that's one of the things like I said, I liked about Castlevania is you could see it being someone you knew or potentially seeing yourself in a Belmont because it's a dude who just like, all right, I got to do something about this. Dracula's, being evil and people are getting zglumped and gotta gotta find a way to fight. And, as you said, the different tools. You got to have the right tool for the job and
Right.
figuring that out. And I think that's part of the fun of the challenge. But
You know,
I loved that game design because I think it is something that clearly has worked over the decades with how many Castlevania games are there now?
God,
I
no,
lost
I
count.
think there's like 30,
it's
I
one
think.
more. 30? It's like 20
I
or
think
30.
I mean, it's hard to say because, they make subtle changes between
Mm,
like Japanese and American versions.
hmm.
So, and some of them, the titles are different. So I think there's like 30 or 33 of them. But and then there's like the one for the kick and there's one where they
Game
almost have
Boy.
like a Street
Mhm.
Fighter style where they're fighting each other. I don't remember which console or which system that was for, but yeah, there's a lot of them.
Mm.
Konami's definitely made some good money
They made some money.
off that IP.
Yes.
Well, well, Scott, it's funny you bring up the overpowered part because when you start Symphony of the Night,
Hmm.
Alucard has all his weapons for
Mm.
like the first mission. And then at the end of the first mission, Dracula shows up, or I forgot if it was Dracula or Death. So I think it was Death, and Death shatters you, like it sends a beam, and then you lose all your weapons. They get scattered across the castle, and then your stats are down to like nothing. Like you're at level 1, where before you were like level 250. And then
Hmm.
so it's this really cool thing where they actually fixed that issue. So if you wanted to play as D, it would be D powered, and for every like in Highlander, like when every kill you get a little bit stronger.
Hmm.
So that's how they fixed that because they kept the RPG element in Symphony of the Night. And I don't mean just to talk about that one, but that's just the one that had like almost everything and was like the turn in time for gaming because you had a 2D side scroller on a 3D console,
Hmm.
you know,
Now
with
you're
some
now you're
3D
making me
elements built
sad
in.
that I never played Castlevania Symphony of the Night back
Oh
in the
my
day.
Oh,
God,
it's brilliant.
you
It's
got it, man. It's
brilliant.
available everywhere.
Yeah.
I may have to go back and find it now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's absolutely worth a playthrough. Yeah.
I think you can download it on either the PS4, PS5, or actually, I think you can download it on one of those. I believe.
That would be interesting. I mean, yeah, I'd have to, because I brought all my systems back from Japan, right? Because if you get an adapter, not not all of these things work like that, but but the video games, if you get a Japanese like an adapter, you can plug it in US
Hmm.
electronics, and you can still play the video game. So I have several of my game systems that I had when I was living in Japan that I brought with me. So, and I'm pretty sure somewhere in a closet I have, Symphony of Blood somewhere.
Okay.
Wow.
See, my problem is for a lot of these things, you can only rebuy them on specific consoles. I haven't owned a
Hmm.
console in decades, and I mailed off my old PS2 with all the games as a gift. So,
Wow.
There was, there's
uh,
definitely,
hey, if
working
if
at
Steam
Davis
Deck
Films.
has it,
Yeah. Exactly. Well, uh, I was blessed because for 15 years working at Davis Films, part of my job was to play Wolfenstein, yeah, Silent
Right.
Hill,
Right.
Resident Evil. That was like my job. I mean, like literally, people would come to the office. We'd have a meeting, and I'd have the TV and the game console, paused for the meeting, and they'd be like, "Oh, are you playing video games on the job?" I'm like, "That is part of my job." Like this giant notebook taking down notes while I'm playing the game. So that got me back into consoles. And now, I mean, so now it's like it's hard for me to even think about our work without having at least one console because I don't like computer games on my computer because I try to keep work and
mm,
gaming separate. So it's, it can be easily addictive. The only one I have is Elder Scrolls Online. And that, it's like when you're having some, writer's block or some problem, oh, I'll just jump on and, kind of
No,
change my
you
mood.
don't want to
And
do
all of a
that.
sudden, 4 hours of, I'm like, oh my God, it's time for bed. So
yep,
I keep
yeah.
that completely separate.
The
Yeah,
tower has video games. The laptop, no video games. The laptop does
There you
not
go.
even
Yeah.
have Spotify or Pandora on it. If I'm on the laptop writing, the only way I'll listen to music is off the phone. So
Oh,
yeah, there is
the
something to be
tricks.
said for
Yeah.
separation.
Yeah, yeah.
I would also say that the move from 2D to 3D has not been great for the Castlevania video game franchise. Because after that, when they went full 3D, it has some of the same problems that the Vampire Hunter D game in the Japanese only release for
Mhm.
the Vampire Hunter D game for the PS1, where movements are clunky, level design is not as good as the platform design. It's very difficult to recreate the 2D platforming experience in a 3D environment. And I think the only ones that have ever gotten close is the Mario franchise
Hmm.
because they have such an incredible team of developers who understand the need for understand how to take a 2D platforming challenge into a 3D space. It's not a simple thing to do. And most of the Castlevania games have not really achieved this well, in the 2000s and even up till now. And what you do see happen is games like Devil May Cry
Hmm.
and what's the other one where you play as Death after the apocalypse is another game franchise where it's very similar in terms of the idea, like God of War, even, where you
Mhm.
take an insane 3D environment that has 2D platforming elements. Other gaming franchises have figured it out, but the Castlevania developers, the closest thing to that again would be Devil May Cry, where you have a person with a whip who's fighting demons and vampires and werewolves and Frankenstein analogs and things like that. But the Castlevania games themselves haven't really made that transition, and they haven't really been all. I mean, people buy them for name value, but you
Hmm.
haven't had a smash Castlevania 3D hit, not on the level of most of the 2D titles. It just hasn't happened. I don't know what's going on, but
Yeah,
Well,
platforming
there
in
was
3D can be a
yeah,
challenge.
yeah,
yeah,
except
there
except with the Mario franchise.
yeah. Well,
Bungie
at least
actually, I thought, did a good job with it in Destiny too. There were a lot
yeah.
of
Mm, yeah,
platforming challenges for missions, and to get it done in time, you really had to be able to skip around and navigate in 3D. And oh brother, I can't remember the name of it, but there was a really, really good sniper rifle that to get it, you had to platform through to the fighting part. And if you didn't do it fast enough, it was really hard to get done in time. So the better you platformed, the quicker you got to the combat part. And you know, I got to hand it to them. I think they did a good job with making it challenging for the average person, doable, and for the crazy good people the chance to speed run it.
Hmm.
So, it is possible. It's just it is hard.
Yeah, and at least in Konami's situation, like when we were doing Silent Hill with them, they shifted for a while. They really refocused a lot of their efforts into gambling machines. Like, and they didn't put it was when Kojima and them had a rift, right?
Mm.
The initial break. And they went really we thought they were going to be making more Silent Hill games. And they really put a big pause on that and really leaned heavily into kind of the low-hanging fruit of the gambling machines, the gambling licensing and things like that. And
Pachinko stuff.
so, yeah, I mean, we were like, "Oh, when, what how can we wanna make another one with you," and it we wanted to work with them on their next game, and they were like, "Yeah, not really," and so it's nice to see that they're having another Silent Hill kind of more Silent Hills are coming out now. There's one coming out, relatively soon. It looks really good. So this will be like the first Silent Hill game I get to play that's not work related, in
Nice.
in like 15, 16 years. Just gonna play it for fun. So it's definitely a different experience.
Oh, and by the way, thanks, Ian. The name of the game was Darksiders. That's the one where it's like you play as death, like you're one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse
Oh,
after the
interesting.
apocalypse, but you're trying to like kind of fix things. It's an incredible game, but it has these insane platforming elements, and it's horror based, supernatural horror based, and yeah, I mean, I feel like there could be a whole conversation about 2D platformers that moved to 3D that still maintain the level of success. I would say Sonic the Hedgehog, you know, obviously Super Smash Brothers, which is a offshoot of the Mario stuff, is also a massive, massive, massive success. Which is basically a 2D beat 'em up, but it has like you can move around the map in certain ways. It's very interesting, and I hope that folks at Konami do get some developers in there. And I think Darksiders, if you ever get a chance, I wish we could put up video for comparison. I could see what I'm talking about. But I think Darksiders would be the perfect place for where you could go with a new Castlevania game, or hopefully a Vampire Hunter D game in the future. The Darksiders engine is very, very well done, and it's very similar to like Zelda, also like the,
Okay.
the the Nintendo 64 Zeldas, specifically Ocarina of Time and Majora's
Mhm,
Mask.
mhm, mhm.
They have also it was a great way of taking Zelda from a 2D world map into a 3D world map and keeping the same charm. And I feel that that's what was missing from the Vampire Hunter D game for the PS, which I did play in Japanese. I didn't know what was going on, but I didn't like how long it took when you opened the door. It had to load the next screen, and it took a really long time. And I felt that whoever designed that game, I don't know how much they read the books. I don't know if they read it and seen any manga, but it felt like whoever was doing that never really knew a lot about Vampire Hunter D. Maybe somebody signed a contract, was like, "You guys just go do it," and
Hmm.
it had the Vampire Hunter D accoutrements and the mise en scène, but it did not feel like a Vampire Hunter D experience because I played the game and it was very hard to navigate certain levels. You pull your sword out; it takes a while for it to. I mean, it was just a very clunky is the word.
Yeah.
There were a
Yeah.
lot of PS1 titles which were extremely clunky, and I feel that for all the great PS1 games, I would say a good 60% of them were very clunky titles, and the 40% that weren't is what gave it its reputation as a classic console, and the
Yeah.
fact it played DVDs. You know, I mean, I think that's what killed the Dreamcast was the fact that they didn't come out with a DVD player built in to its next gen system at the time.
Yeah.
And anyway, but yeah, so those are my thoughts about that. I feel that the Vampire Hunter D game needed a lot more work. I mean, it felt like they released a 70% done game, and I did play it, and I only played it 2 or 3 times. I just couldn't do it anymore because it was not fun.
Thank you for listening to Lefty Speaks, the official Vampire Hunter D podcast, hosted by Brandon Easton, Neal Fischer, and Scott McLean. This podcast is created by Unified Pictures and Nine Realms. Narration by Lauren Evallen-Muller. Recording and editing by Nine Realms. Produced by Scott McLean and Ian E. Muller. Based on the works created by Hideyuki Kikuchi. Happy hunting.